My name is Brian Castner. I'm a former explosive ordnance disposal officer. Since leaving the Air Force, I travel around the world to conflict areas to investigate war crimes, and this is everything I'm authorized to tell you. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were IED wars, improvised munitions, improvised devices. You just had to assume that there was a bomb somewhere at your feet that you had not found yet. The work is tough. I mean, anyone who does this work can't say that they're not affected by it. You would be inhuman to not be affected by it. The joke about cutting the red wire. It's funny how consistent it is. Obviously, the wire colors have absolutely no correspondence to absolutely anything. But no, you don't cut the red one. You actually don't cut any of them. The biggest misconception of Hollywood when it comes to EOD is this idea that you have to be crazy to do the work, and that the people doing the work and working with explosives are somehow off in some way. That perception is pervasive. It's even all the way, to The Hurt Locker, which won the Academy Award to have EOD be a subject of a film of, with that stature on the one hand is incredible. And on the other, it makes us look like reckless cowboys with a death wish, which could not be further from the truth. So the drama of the film is this increasingly risky behavior and this idea that, of taking any risk, not having a sense of self-preservation. The first couple minutes of the film of an actual EOD operation is correct. That said, everything in between the first few minutes and the last few minutes is Hollywood and makes a good movie. I think maybe something that the public doesn't understand about the EOD profession is the amount of time we spend memorializing and remembering everyone that we've lost. So we have the EOD Warrior Foundation that raises money for the children of men and women that we've lost in all wars. We have a memorial wall down in Florida. So you go to school, to EOD school, every day, passing the wall of all of the names of every man and woman who has died in the line of duty from World War II through to today. And so when there's a representation in the public of EOD being risky, cavalier, cowboys, there's maybe an association or an implication or something that there's so many people with their name on the wall who died in combat because they were that way, that they were risky, that they, just did whatever and weren't paying attention. And it couldn't be further from the truth. I first deployed to Iraq at the end of 2004. I went to Balad Air Base, which is just north of Baghdad. I did one tour there. And then I went back to Iraq in Kirkuk for 2006, and then did a tour there. And I mean, this sounds so naive now, but I was excited. And I was excited because I had been training for years to do a thing, and I was finally going to be able to do that thing. And that's a very, 27-year-old's version of looking at that. So I was the flight commander of the EOD unit. A flight is roughly equivalent to a company, and we were there to support 1st Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division. And so as the equivalent of the company commander, I'm going to have a chief who's my number 2. We're going to have an ops center, and then we're going to have a number of teams, and a team is 3 people, and they're going to be divided out either to different FOBs, forward operating bases, or they're going to be assigned to route clearance packages. The route clearance teams are basically combat engineers with EOD assigned, whose whole job it was just to drive the highways and get blown up, or hopefully not get blown up, but find the device and take it apart. And so they would just drive the highway before the logistics movements would go to be able to clear that out. And then we had emergency response teams, quick reaction teams, QRF, quick reaction force teams, however you want to call it, a couple in Kirkuk, and then some at the outlying FOBs. IEDs, improvised explosive devices, are just that. They are put together by a bomber, a bit of wire here and a radio and a main charge of a artillery shell and maybe some sort of arming switch or something else that goes into that. It's improvised because it's just made for that one attack. IEDs are a very, very particular solution to a problem that the insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan had, which is that they did not have their own military equipment to challenge the U.S. military. There was an occupation. There was U.S. military on the road running around. It was hard for them to target in the bases. It's hard for them to shoot down aircraft. But there was a weak spot that was being exploited, and that is these vehicles physically rolling down the road. It's another reason IEDs became so popular, is that consumer electronics with wireless technology exploded at the same time that these wars are really getting going. So there are just more and more things you can buy off the shelf where I push a button here and something happens over there. And so then I can modify the thing happening over there to, instead of a beep going off or a noise or whatever the case may be, I can modify that to now a device is going off. And as the wars went on, the job got a lot more dangerous because the bombers or the emplacers, the people building the devices and putting them in, they were often placing secondary and tertiary devices that were meant to target the people coming to clear the first device. They had been watching for long enough that they knew our trends, even as we tried to mix them up and do different things. We were always changing up what we would do, but the bomber was changing that fast as well. And so my number one concern when arriving on scene was not the package that was called in. That's easy. I know where that is. My number one job was making myself safe and my team safe and our security escort safe and the people that lived in the area safe immediately upon arriving on scene, because you just had to assume that there was a bomb somewhere at your feet that you had not found yet. Really, our job at the end of the day is to take apart every device. It didn't matter who it was targeting. It was a car bomb at a school. It was a car bomb at a daycare. We took apart a number of those. At a certain point, you're just trying to make everyone safe. And so yes, that particular roadside bomb was meant to target a US convoy. True. However, it was just as likely to hit a civilian truck that happened to be driving by trying to take melons to market. And I think that there's understanding that mental aspect is important even when you're out operating every day in combat, because this may sound funny, it's easy to get complacent. Well, yeah, there's probably an IED out here, whatever. You are constantly mentally battling, staying on the edge. There's a reason that we pull up. We check, we do what's called 5 and 25. You check within 5 meters of your vehicle. You check within 25 meters of your vehicle. You get the robot. You go through these steps. You don't want to be rote. You don't want to just be formulaic and do the same thing every time. You don't want to do everything the same way. They're going to be watching. They're going to change something. That's going to get you killed. So something I learned in school is to visualize. And this is something that pro athletes do, Olympians and people that are really operating at a high level. And it's something I learned from one of the instructors. You would visualize the night before what you're going to do the next day. The tools that we relied on first and foremost was the robot. The robot is there to physically walk up to the thing, take it apart, use the gripper, do the stuff that you can't do in a safe way. We use a lot of other tools. We use jammers to try to keep the bomber from being able to blow it up remotely. Something that may be surprising is that the best way to take apart an explosive device without it going off is to use explosives yourself, to use an energetic tool, we would call it, to try to get it to disassemble without detonating. So sometimes those explosive tools are carried down by the robot. You put it in the gripper and it drives down and it's putting it near the device, and then we can set it off from a long distance. In the typical operation from Iraq, your robot is checking out, doing a recon, seeing what's needed, coming back, picking up a tool and dropping it in a certain place to get the effect you want. The first thing you do is you send in a robot, and if your robot blows up, send in another robot, and if that robot blows up, I will drive you a third robot before a person walks down. Because if you thought about it, losing a $250,000 robot is way, way better than losing a person. Sometimes you're walking around and you stumble upon the thing and you realize that there's a device at your feet and you need to take an action immediately right then to save your own life. But to be 100 yards away and say a person needs to go and do this thing, that is the gravest decision. Walking down yourself is pretty lonely. It's called the long walk for a reason. In that moment, the thing that lets you do that is a certain confidence, which is born of your training and your skills and your knowledge and the belief that you're doing the safest possible thing in that moment. We've lost a lot of men and women that way. I mean, we didn't lose those people because they were making an offhanded, cavalier choice. We lost them because it was still the safest thing to do, and it still got them killed. As the war went on, I mean, people just got sick of getting blown up all the time. And at a certain point, you say, we just need to stop this. You can only have your convoy blown up every day for so long before you say, we should really catch the person who's doing this. When I was first at Balad on my first tour, I remember being asked to go and do a post-blast investigation first week there. And our answer was, what's that? And we drove out there and we looked at the hole and we said, yep, something went off there. And what do you want us to do? We just didn't have the capacity at that time. And then gradually you build these task forces. We had weapons intelligence teams. We had a unit called SEXI, the Combined Explosive Exploitation Cell in Baghdad. You had FBI labs. You had all of this stuff and this infrastructure to do the real forensic analysis on exactly how they were made, what's their capability, what can they do, where do they come from, and not just from a detailed technical standpoint, but from an emotional standpoint. How do human beings work? How do they tend to enter a room, leave a room? Do you leave a car running? Do you these little bits of human behavior and how that would figure into a scene? Understanding those motivations and recreating that scene, that is really that's the heart of the work. One of my first incidents at Kirkuk, we had explosively formed penetrators. So these are an Iranian provided weapon that are made to basically punch through armor. And they were relatively rare at the time. They got more and more common through 2007. And if we had found those a year before, we probably would have blown them up. And this time we saved them and we packed them in a crate. And I got on a helicopter to Baghdad the next day to specifically deliver these things, to do the real forensic analysis, everything down to the little rivets and the little caps, to be like, oh yeah, we've seen this rivet before. That's not something we knew how to do at the beginning of the war. And it's only something we learned over the course of it. So my job as the commander is obviously to keep all my teams safe, organize and lead and provide them the equipment that they need to work. We never lost anyone on my tours. I'm proud of that. At the same time, the people that we, lost in the EOD family generally, that doesn't mean that any of those folks did anything wrong. Luck is a massive part of this. We had a saying that you need 5 things to get through Iraq: luck, training, luck, equipment, and luck. And I would always rather be lucky than good. You can't do the work if you're not just physically safe, but have the feeling of it. You can't control the fact that you're in Iraq. You can't control the fact that the U.S. is fighting a war in Iraq. You can't control your assignment. There are so many things outside of your control. And so you have to come to peace with that and focus on the things that you can. I think there's 2 main sets of character traits for the kind of person that goes into EOD. One of it is a combination of mental acuity and physical handiness. It's like being a surgeon, except if you fail, then you die and not the patient. And the kind of person that gets into that has to be book smart, has to do math, has to understand physics, has to be really analytical and attention to detail. The other part of it, though, is just there's a certain attitude or a certain smartassery, if I can call it that. So I got an electrical engineering degree. I was not a great engineer. When you're an engineer, you see like your alarm clock and you're really curious how it works. And so you take it apart and then you put it back together. The EOD tech sees the alarm clock, takes it all apart, maybe with a hammer, and then can't be bothered to put it back together. And that's much more me. So I did Air Force ROTC. I got a scholarship when I was 17 to go to college at Marquette and get an electrical engineering degree, and the Air Force paid for it. It was a very different world. When I actually graduated college, joined the military in 2000 again, I was interested in EOD. So I got to EOD school in February of 2003. So the invasion of Afghanistan had already happened, and Iraq was coming quickly, and we knew it was coming. And my eyes were wide open that I was not joining a profession that would be sleepy and I would just do my time in the military and move on. I knew that I was going into something where combat was coming quickly because of the training. In EOD, everybody attends the same school. So it's Navy School Explosive Ordnance Disposal at Eglin Air Force Base, which is Fort Walton Beach, Destin area in the panhandle of Florida. And that school takes 7 to 12 months, depending, and it all happens right there. Yeah, the hardest part of EOD school is the pace. The first day you basically do all of physics, and then you take a test the next day. And then the next day, you do all of math, and you take a test the next day. Just the pace, it is relentless. Then the next section is demolitions, and you start working with explosives very, very quickly. And that's because the school needs to figure out if you're gonna freak out or not. And there are some people that the first time they pick up a blasting cap, they can't touch it. Or the feeling of putting a bunch of C4 together and putting it on a pile of bombs and landmines or what else you're getting rid of, like you are standing on top of your own death. And some people just, the feeling of that is like too much and you're like, I'm done, I'm out of here. It's DOR, drop on request. Like you have to be a volunteer to do EOD. Like if it's not right for you, you should not be in it. So you need an 85% on your test to pass. And a lot of the questions or a lot of the things you might do in a physical test are worth 16 points. So you do this one thing, you fail. And that reflects really the nature of the work. You do any one of these things and it's going to kill you in real life. In our class specifically, 30 of us started together and 3 of us finished. No matter what basic things you learn in EOD school, there is no preparation for the bomber who is building devices in your neighborhood and is putting them out on the street corner at the first time you drive down the road. And there's no way to prepare for that because that particular bomber is also changing most likely his designs all the time. After I got out of the military, I became a contractor, I became a journalist, I was covering war in a different way. So I joined Amnesty in 2018, March of 2018. I was initially hired as the weapons investigator and as a military analyst. We're a watchdog because the work that we're doing is trying to keep as many civilians safe and free of harm as possible. The risks to being an investigator with Amnesty in a conflict area is very different than when you're in the military. Being in the military and being in an armored vehicle and being in uniform obviously makes you a target, but you also have the entire US military behind you if you're being attacked and something happens. It's almost exactly the inverse as an investigator with Amnesty, where you are there with very little support except your own wits, a little bit of money, your friends and network, and your ability to blend in and your ability to essentially not get noticed to the maximum extent possible. The biggest risks then change. They are kidnapping. They are normal banditry in some places. They are being in the wrong place at the wrong time. If you are drawing attention to yourself, you are making yourself a target. You need a reason for no one to notice you. And so I try to do things so I am, yes, always blending in. So I arrived in Kabul in July of 2021. And the reason that I and my colleague went is because the Taliban were winning. And as they were winning, there were a number of violations and crimes, was our understanding, that were happening in the course of that. People caught in the crossfire between the Taliban and the Afghan National Army, people that died in US airstrikes that had occurred recently, and then crimes committed by the Taliban. There were a number of massacres, targeted killings, executions. And so we were documenting that, and we were planning on leaving, except every day the Taliban were getting closer and provincial capitals started to fall. We tried to leave and we couldn't. We had tickets to leave Kabul the day after Kabul ended up falling. So that morning, the 15th of August, we had a plan. We had tickets to fly out the next day. Our plan was to essentially hope that the Afghan National Army would hold Kabul for some amount of time, and that essentially we were going to go to the airport as early as possible, essentially the night before, and then stay overnight at the airport and fly out early the next day. The US had announced that they were sending troops to hold the airport. No one had a better option. And so that morning, the 15th, we're packed up, we're ready to go. We're planning to leave later that day. And then there's gunshots immediately outside our compound, steps away from our compound. The hotel staff run out armed. Everybody heads to a safe room, and basically all the plans changed immediately, which was, we're not going to the airport tonight. We are going to the airport right this second. We got out of the safe room. We got in a car. We drove the back roads. Main highways through Kabul are absolutely packed. The Afghan National Army had essentially disappeared. The Afghan police had disappeared. You could see uniforms just left on the side of the road. It's kind of every person for themselves at that point. We got to the airport that night or that evening before dark, and there was absolutely a feeling like, okay, we're here. We don't see the Americans, but they're here somewhere. The US has promised that they are setting up a secure area here. We're good now. And, we waited and we had a plan to sleep and stay overnight, and we did our check-ins and whatever else. And then after dark, we noticed that people in the concourse start moving kind of closer into the main part of the international airport. We would learn later, there's two sides to the Kabul airport. There's a civilian side in the south and a military side up in the north. Early evening, we get word, there's rumors spread extremely fast, that the Taliban had entered the airport. Basically, all of the security disappeared. If you can imagine, the outside of the Kabul airport in some ways at the time, looked like any other airport. You had to go through a metal detector. You had to go through the equivalent of TSA to get inside. There's still people checking passports. There's still people working at the front desk, right, of the various airlines. And then imagine walking back out through the hallway and everybody's gone. Every security official is gone. And it essentially turned into a free-for-all. It was pretty clear that the flights the next day were not happening. Just the rumor of the Taliban entering was enough to basically sow this chaos. And so me and my colleague, we're grabbing our stuff, and we're essentially out on the tarmac. We're out on, where planes are parked. People are trying to rush to get onto aircraft, civilian aircraft that are sitting there. There's some armed guards that are pushing people out. It's completely dark. I have a friend who's a journalist. who has made it to the military side. And he's like, you need to get over here. And I'm looking across and I can see the tails of the C-17s, the American C-17s. And he's like, which side are you on? I'm like, I'm on the civilian side. He's like, you need to be over here. And so me and my Amnesty colleague, we ran across the runway. And we're moving across and we're in the grass, and then we're like on a parking apron, and then we're in the grass again. And all of a sudden, these lights pop on, and it's an American armored vehicle. And I do one of these things, like holding my passport. And the guy I'm with does one of these things, holding the passport. And, we're just lucky we didn't get shot, essentially. And so we get picked up by the Americans, and they basically said, what in the hell are you doing here? And we said, the Taliban are in the civilian side of the airport. And they said, what are you talking about? More and more people started to come to, then it was like hundreds of people crossing the airfield. And these are the videos that you saw. We ended up having to go and essentially getting ourselves rearrested, so to speak, pick us up and, eventually got on military flights out of Kabul. We published that report in December, several months later. And we included essentially everything that we were able to prove up until the fall of Kabul, including U.S. drone strike on a car in a Kabul neighborhood that the U.S. thought was a car bomb and was not. And they killed a number of people. Many, many civilians died in the course of the fighting over that summer, up until the day that Kabul fell. I and a small team, we entered Ukraine a few days after the war started. In February of 2022 is when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. And we set up in Lviv, which is in far western Ukraine. And the reason we set up there is because we simply didn't know how far and how fast the Russians were going to get in from the eastern border. So we set up in Lviv, and we were interviewing people that had fled from the east. We were the first to prove to have physical evidence of the use of cluster munitions. Cluster munitions being, weapons that disperse these small submunitions over a wide area. They're banned under international law for a number of reasons. Cluster munitions are a category of weapons that's deployed in two stages. You have a carrier, and that carrier could be a missile, could be a bomb, clamshell bomb, it could be an artillery round or something else. But it's fired into an area, and then that carrier opens, and it spreads many, many submunitions, bomblets, cluster munitions over a wide area. And depending on the type, this can be an area the size of a football field or even larger. You can't aim where all these little bomblets are going. So by their nature, they might hit a military target, they might hit civilians that are nearby, because they're just randomly falling wherever the air takes them. They also tend to have a high dud rate. And by that I mean some of them detonate, but some of them don't. And what that means is, 200 of these fall in an area, maybe only 80% of them detonate, 90%. That could be 20 or 40 submunitions that are just sitting there with sensitive fuses that really might detonate if you kick them, if you pick them up, if you accidentally brush by one. The fuses are extremely dangerous. And so there's a convention against the use, stockpile, manufacture of cluster munitions. And unfortunately, the United States, for example, is not a state party. So we had kind of rented a flat in one of the neighborhoods downtown, and we're interviewing people in the flat, and he pulls out a piece of the frag that a surgeon had pulled out of him. And I'm taking photographs with a little ruler or whatever else to prove that those were 9N235 or 9N210 submunitions. We're trying to gather that physical evidence and the testimony and where were you, and trying to build that case that yes, on this particular day, at this particular time, this weapon was used in this place, killed or injured this civilian. That's the heart of the work. So to identify weapons, we're looking for pieces that have what we call key ID features. And what that means is what is on this weapon that is on no other weapon. So we have what's called an ordnance order of battle, and that's a military term that basically says what are all the weapons that are being used in this conflict and what are their sources. When I was in Mykolaiv in July of 2022, at that point, Russia still was occupying Kherson, and the front was between Mykolaiv and Kherson, and it was an extremely active front. So there were many evenings or nights where you would hear an explosion or two that would interrupt your sleep, and that was normal. But there was one particular night where it got to be early in the morning, 4 or 5 in the morning, I don't remember exactly when, where there was a detonation that was way, way, way too close. And of course, you shoot straight out of bed and you're looking for the bomb shelters. There were a couple more impacts. And then, of course, first thing in the morning, as soon as it's light, we're out to try to figure out, what had happened, because again, that was way too close. Those 220 millimeter rockets had dropped cluster munitions, but it was only a couple hundred meters away from our hotel. There was a hospital complex that was nearby. So we essentially spent the morning identifying craters. In these particular submunitions, they splash, is what it looks like. There's like a shallow crater and then a ring of fragmentary divots, if it hits asphalt or concrete, especially. Some of them are duds, and so we're taking photos of the duds. Some of them are, had detonated. They had detonated on the hospital grounds. We are collecting evidence to hopefully guide international justice later. But, when I find a piece of frag that, that was used when I'm out digging in a hole and I pull up one of those pieces of Blue Arrow 7 frag, I don't take it home as a war souvenir. I dig it out of the hole, I identify it, and I leave it for others. The only way you're going to find out what happened is by talking to people. If you can build some rapport and some trust, people will tell you things that we never would have known when I was in the military. For all of the fancy intel streams that the US government has, I don't know a substitute for speaking to the person that lived next door. The Mariupol theater bombing is an excellent example of how challenging this work is. So in March of 2022, the Russians attacked the drama theater in central Mariupol. This was like a major opera house, a major cultural landmark in the very center of the city. And that theater, because of the sturdiness of its construction, had served as a shelter for people that were trying to flee fighting in other parts of the city. And the Russians struck it with 1 or 2 very large aircraft bombs and killed a number of people there. We spoke to dozens of people that were there, had been there, had family members there, had been there themselves at the time of the strike. There were a lot of conspiracy theories. The Russians were saying, it was a false flag. The Ukrainians put a device inside their own building. And so the challenge was to find people from Mariupol. We can't get to Mariupol itself. It's being attacked. Find people that had been at the theater. Find people that had been at the theater when it was struck. And then people that could actually name victims that they know their family member was killed. The things that we had to do, we found the plans, the original architectural plans for the theater through a number of sources. And then we have these plans in front of us so we can get on the phone with people and talk for hours and say, okay, what room were you in? In the end, we were only able to find the names for very few, a handful. And we were able to prove at least a dozen people were killed. People might be surprised to know that most human rights violations, most civilian deaths, most of the horror and tragedy that comes through conflict is not with fancy weapons. It is with old-fashioned rifles that have been around for decades. And the way the world is awash in weapons, it's just more and more possible or feasible that these legacy weapons continue to cause harm. The US has been cleaning out stockpiles of weapons that I didn't even think were still in the inventory anymore. Old Hawk, surface-to-air missile systems that the U.S. had decommissioned long ago, Ukraine is using to shoot down Shahed drones right now.
Do you feel like there is a weapon today or could be in the future that might have a similar level of efficacy in warfare similar to the IED had in Iraq and Afghanistan?
I think the best analogy for the IED and a certain weapon being used in context, I think the analogy is the FPV drone in Ukraine. And the question is whether FPV drones, as used currently, is the future of warfare, or if it is a context-specific weapon. My personal view is that it is tailor-made. And that FPV drone, the reason it is so expansively used by both sides is because there's a long front line, there's a shortage of infantry, there's a shortage of artillery, and there's an ability to make these weapons locally in a way and quickly and scale that up in a way that it's very difficult to scale up artillery, armor, training more infantry, etc. Some of these things that are tailor-made, they really do change the nature of war. Machine guns were a novelty until World War I, and then they completely changed the nature of war. So it's hard to tell if FPV drones are machine guns that absolutely change how war is conducted, or if it's really a one-off. So investigating U.S. airstrikes in Somalia was my first case, my first investigation at Amnesty. And so it is quite a way to start, to having been a member of the U.S. military and then investigating the U.S. military. One of the most frustrating things dealing with the U.S. military is just getting them to admit they did the thing that you proved that they did. We had an initial report with a number of cases where the U.S. military denied every single one. And then over several years after that, we documented more and more cases. And it was only one of the last ones at the very end that the U.S. said, actually, you're right. We did kill that woman in her home with a drone strike, and we shouldn't have done that. Congress has set aside money to essentially provide what the U.S. calls ex gratia payments. In international law, we would call them reparations or something else. It's a tangible way for the U.S. military to say, we did this, we shouldn't have, we acknowledge that your family member was killed. The reason to have reparations is rarely because the payment itself, obviously it doesn't replace a child. The payment doesn't fix everything about their life. The reparations are a sign that a country, a military has acknowledged harm in a way beyond mere words. It is more than a token. It is more than a press release. And I have found that families have found closure when you do get all the way through that process. Actually getting the U.S. military to go through the whole process and actually get the money to these families is excruciating. And in many cases, we still haven't. I personally find a lot of meaning in being able to say to a family, we believe you and we can prove it, and we're going to. But that's only part of it. Nothing returns a child, but forcing an organization to say, yes, we really did that, especially when they've been denying it for how many years ahead of time. It's like the circle isn't complete until there is some tangible, real transfer that means something, not that it fixes the problem.
Hi, I'm a producer on Authorized account. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe and comment with more topics that you'd like us to cover in this series.